Hi everyone. Mark and Emily had a relationship most people would envy. They had met in college, and from the moment they locked eyes across a crowded lecture hall, it felt like fate. Mark was reserved, ambitious, and precise, a finance major with a quiet intensity. Emily, on the other hand, was everything he wasn't: warm, extroverted, and spontaneous. She had a talent for making every moment feel vibrant, and together they balanced each other out, creating a love that felt steadfast and unbreakable. After college, they married and moved into a charming two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place that felt like the perfect backdrop for their love story. Mark worked long hours at a finance firm, building a career he hoped would one day support the family they dreamed of. Emily stayed home, pouring herself into their life together, decorating the house, filling it with warmth and laughter. Every night they shared their dreams for the future. They talked about children, vacations they'd take, adventures waiting for them. Mark treasured those moments, believing their love was immune to the hardships that life could bring. Even on the busiest days, he made time for her, whether it was surprising her with flowers, cooking her favorite meal, or taking her out for a spontaneous coffee date. But after a few years, he noticed a restlessness in Emily, a longing for something beyond their domestic life. So when she expressed an interest in returning to work, he encouraged her, believing that the job would fill whatever void she felt. She eventually found a part-time HR position at a local firm, and the excitement in her eyes reminded Mark of the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. They began to talk about her job at dinner, laughing over her stories of office antics, sharing knowing glances about the quirks of corporate life. Yet as time passed, he began to notice subtle changes, shifts that were almost invisible, but just enough to stir something inside him. At first, he brushed them off, thinking they were just adjustments to her new role. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was quietly slipping away. At first, the changes in Emily were minor, barely noticeable things. She started taking more care with her appearance. She'd spend a little extra time in front of the mirror each morning, wearing dresses that hugged her figure a bit more closely, choosing lipstick shades he hadn't seen in years. She even started wearing perfume regularly, something she hadn't done in a long time. Mark noticed, of course, and when he complimented her, she'd smile. But there was a distance in it, like her thoughts were somewhere else. Emily began talking about her new job with enthusiasm, sharing stories about her colleagues, especially one name that seemed to pop up more than others: Jake. He was the building's maintenance worker, a man she described with unusual warmth. "Jake's always around fixing things," she'd say, laughing about his charm and jokes, always adding that he was so helpful. Mark would listen, thinking it was harmless, and yet there was something in her tone that felt different, a flicker of admiration he couldn't quite place. One evening, she came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shining. She mentioned how Jake had helped her move some boxes after hours, recounting the story with a bit too much detail, laughing as if it were the highlight of her day. When Mark gently teased her about it, she waved him off, but he could see her cheeks redden, her gaze shifting away. Her absences started becoming more frequent. She would come home late, explaining her delays as last-minute projects or extra tasks that needed her attention. Mark wanted to believe her, but something gnawed at him, a feeling that went beyond the surface, a quiet unease that grew with each unexplained absence. He told himself it was only the stress of her job, but deep down, the doubt lingered. One Saturday, she announced she needed to pick up some files from the office. Mark offered to go with her, hoping to spend time together, but she declined, insisting it was a quick trip. She returned 2 hours later, looking too energized for a simple errand. There was a glow to her that didn't feel right, a lightness he hadn't seen in a while, and it wasn't directed at him. That was when he noticed how often she'd check her phone, the way she'd glance at it with a faint smile. When he'd ask about her day, she'd offer vague responses, almost evasive, brushing off his questions with a dismissive laugh. She'd always been open with him, but now there was a guardedness in her gaze, a hesitation that felt foreign. One evening at a neighborhood gathering, he saw her across the room, laughing with friends. Her face was animated, a warmth radiating from her that he hadn't seen in months. But it was when she glanced away, her gaze distant, that he noticed it, a softness in her expression, a look that wasn't meant for him. And in that moment, he felt the first pang of suspicion. Mark's suspicion began as a quiet whisper, an uncomfortable feeling he tried to ignore. But as the days passed, it grew louder, gnawing at him, demanding his attention. Every time Emily mentioned Jake, it felt like a subtle jab, a reminder of a presence in her life that had no business being there. Jake's name seemed to be woven into every story, every anecdote she shared, always with a touch of admiration that twisted uncomfortably in Mark's stomach. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that he was just being paranoid. But as he watched Emily grow more distant, her late nights more frequent, his doubts hardened. She'd become so guarded, her laughter now reserved for stories he wasn't a part of, her gaze shifting away when he looked at her too closely. The warmth they had once shared seemed to be replaced by something fragile, something that felt as though it might shatter if he probed too deeply. One evening, as they sat at dinner, he asked her casually about her day. "How was work?" he'd asked, hoping to hear the usual light-hearted stories. But instead, she'd shrugged, muttering something vague about a busy day before falling silent. Her focus seemed elsewhere, her mind wrapped up in something or someone he couldn't see. When he pressed, asking if everything was all right, she gave him a quick, dismissive smile and changed the subject. As time went on, he noticed she was more protective of her phone, always keeping it close, locking it whenever he was near. Sometimes he'd catch her smiling down at the screen, her eyes bright with a look that once was only for him. When he asked who she was texting, she'd brush it off, saying it was just a friend or work stuff. But the secrecy cut through him, leaving him to wonder who she was really texting and why she was so determined to hide it from him. The unease inside him grew, an unspoken tension that settled over their home like a dark cloud. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was slipping away from him, retreating into a world that didn't include him. Even their physical closeness was gone. She'd pull away from his touch, her excuses mechanical, her affection now a shadow of what it used to be. The love he thought they shared felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. One Friday night, Mark tried to bridge the distance. "Why don't I pick you up from work tonight?" he suggested, hoping it might surprise her, maybe remind her of the life they'd built together. She hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she smiled, tight-lipped. "Oh, that's sweet, but I'll be staying a little late," she replied, just tying up a few loose ends with the team. When she left that night, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't being truthful. He paced the living room, replaying her words over and over in his mind, every detail now tinged with doubt. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He called her, hoping to catch her off guard, to hear something that would settle his mind. After a few rings, she answered, her voice breathless. "Mark, why are you calling?" she asked, her tone carrying a slight edge of surprise and, was it annoyance? As we dive deeper into the twists of this story, I'd love for you to join our storytelling family here at Lost Love Mystery. If you're captivated so far, why not take a second to tap that subscribe button? Each new story brings you a front row seat to unforgettable journeys, ones that just might resonate with your own. Let's continue and see how this story unfolds. "Just wanted to see if you needed a ride home," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Are you still at the office?" There was a pause, a silence that felt like it stretched out forever. "Oh, I had to run out for a bit. I'll be home soon," she said quickly, her voice tense, as if she were rushing to explain. Mark's heart sank. Her words felt like hollow excuses, each one stacking on top of the other, creating a wall between them that he didn't know how to break down. He ended the call, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak that made his hands shake. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence was stacking up, and with each new inconsistency, his trust was eroding faster than he could rebuild it. That weekend, he decided to confront his suspicions in a small way, hoping that a subtle approach might bring her guard down. On Saturday morning, over breakfast, he asked her about her week, watching closely as she recounted her stories. She mentioned a workout with colleagues, casually dropping Jake's name yet again, her tone light, as if she weren't aware of the impact it had on him. Mark took a deep breath, deciding to probe just a little deeper. "Sounds like you and Jake are spending a lot of time together," he said, forcing a smile. What's he like? She paused, her eyes flickering with something unreadable before she smiled. Oh, he's just a nice guy, very helpful around the office, she replied, her voice carefully neutral. But Mark caught the slight flush in her cheeks, the way her gaze drifted when she spoke. It was as though she were hiding something behind her words, a layer of truth she didn't want him to see. From that moment on, Mark felt the weight of suspicion settle on him like a heavy coat he couldn't shake off. Every time she left the house, every time she came home late, his mind raced with questions, doubts, fears that he couldn't voice. He found himself checking the time, mentally cataloging every minute she was away, counting the hours between her departure and return, noting every inconsistency in her stories. The final straw came one night when they attended a friend's birthday party. Mark noticed how Emily kept checking her phone, her face lighting up with an almost childlike smile whenever a new message arrived. At one point, she slipped away from the group, standing in a corner with her back turned, tapping away on her screen. When he approached her, she quickly put her phone down, her expression guarded, a faint blush on her cheeks. "What's up?" he asked casually, forcing his voice to stay light. "Oh, nothing," she replied, too quickly. "Just checking in with a friend." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And that was when he knew. It wasn't just his imagination or paranoia. There was something there, something she was hiding, and it was tearing them apart. The doubt that had once been a quiet whisper was now a relentless roar echoing in his mind every time he looked at her. Mark couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. This expanded version of Section 3 adds greater depth to Mark's growing suspicion, his observations, and his emotional turmoil. It builds the tension by showing his increasing doubt and desperation as he tries to make sense of the changes in Emily's behavior, leading smoothly into the next section where he uncovers the affair. Let me know if this enhances the narrative for you, or if there's anything else you'd like to add. One Thursday night, Mark finally decided to follow her. She'd mentioned another work errand, and after she left, he gave her a few minutes before grabbing his keys and heading out. He tailed her car through the city, his heart pounding as he watched her take an unexpected turn, driving toward a secluded park on the edge of town, a place they used to visit on lazy weekends. Mark parked at a distance, watching as she stepped out of her car. She looked around, almost as if checking to see if anyone was watching. And then, there he was, Jake, waiting under the soft glow of a streetlight. Mark's chest tightened as he watched her walk over, her face lighting up with a warmth he hadn't seen in months. They embraced, standing close, their bodies moving in a way that left no room for doubt. His hands shook as he took a few photos, each snap of his phone a blow to his heart. He watched them laugh, talk, share a kiss that confirmed every fear he had held back. It was real, undeniable. The woman he had loved, the life they had shared, it was all a lie. Mark drove home in silence, his mind numb. Emily's betrayal was a reality he couldn't ignore. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let this go unanswered. That night, he sat in the living room, waiting. Emily came in, her face flushed, barely acknowledging him as she walked past. But he stopped her, his voice steady. "Emily, we need to talk." She turned, her face paling as she saw the look in his eyes. "What about?" "About where you've really been going." He pulled up the photos on his phone, holding them out for her to see. Her face drained of color, her confident demeanor crumbling as she stared at the images. She opened her mouth, stammering, but he cut her off. "How long?" She finally admitted to it, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't. I didn't mean for it to happen." She tried to explain, to plead, but her words were hollow. Mark looked at her with a calm he didn't feel. "I'm moving out tomorrow. You made your choice." Mark had always been a man of logic and strategy, skills that had served him well in his career. But now, he turned those abilities toward a different goal, making sure Emily and Jake faced the full weight of their actions. As he sat in the quiet of their living room, photos of her betrayal open on his phone, he planned his next steps with a calm, icy resolve. First, he organized the evidence. He went through each photo he had taken of her and Jake at the park, each one more damning than the last. He saved them in a secured folder on his computer, ensuring that they were safe from accidental deletion. But it wasn't just the photos. Mark also compiled a list of the dates she had been working late and every excuse she had given him over the past few months. It was painful to revisit, each memory like reopening an old wound, but he wanted his case against her airtight. Once he had everything ready, he crafted a detailed email. He wrote with precision, avoiding any emotional language, letting the facts speak for themselves. The email was addressed to Emily's family, close friends, and even a few of her respected colleagues who had always admired her professionalism. The message was simple. Mark told them about her affair, attaching the evidence he had gathered, letting them see the truth for themselves. There was no anger in his words, only a cold, factual recounting of her actions. But Mark wasn't done. Jake had taken part in this betrayal, and he wasn't going to walk away unscathed. Through a bit of research and a few discreet calls, Mark found the contact information for Jake's supervisor and the company's HR department. Knowing that Jake had used company time and resources for personal reasons, Mark put together another email detailing Jake's inappropriate relationship with a married coworker on company property. He included the photos and a few specific incidents, each one carefully worded to imply how unprofessional and disruptive Jake's behavior had been. By the time Mark hit send, he knew there would be fallout. Emily's image in the eyes of her family and friends would be shattered. The colleagues who respected her would see the truth, and Jake's job would be on the line. For Mark, it was more than revenge. It was the justice he felt she had robbed him of when she chose deceit over honesty. But even as he hit send, Mark felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. This wasn't the life he had wanted. He had never imagined being in this position, orchestrating the unraveling of his own marriage. And yet he knew that he couldn't simply stand by. This was his way of reclaiming his dignity, of showing her that actions have consequences. In the days following his email, Mark's life became strangely quiet. He moved into a small apartment across town, a place that felt foreign and empty. Nights were the hardest, lying in a bed that wasn't his in a room that didn't feel like home. The emptiness echoed around him, a constant reminder of the life he had lost, of the woman he had once loved, who now felt like a stranger. But even as he struggled with the pain of betrayal, he felt a growing sense of relief. The truth was out, his silence finally broken. He no longer had to live with the weight of her lies pressing down on him. It was as if he had been holding his breath for months, and now, for the first time, he could finally exhale. The reactions from their friends and family began to trickle in. Some were sympathetic, reaching out to him with words of comfort. Others, shocked and appalled, distanced themselves from Emily, unwilling to associate with someone who could betray the man who had loved her so deeply. Her family, once warm and welcoming, was devastated by her choices, and Mark heard through mutual friends that they had confronted her, their disappointment clear. Jake's company responded quickly. He was placed on immediate suspension, pending an internal investigation. Mark imagined the shock on Jake's face when he received the news, the smug confidence he'd shown with Emily now stripped away. Jake was no longer just the helpful guy around the office. He was the man who had risked everything for a relationship built on lies. Mark found a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Jake was now facing the consequences of his own actions. Yet, as much as he had set things right externally, Mark knew the real struggle was internal. There were days when he felt as if he were walking through fog, the memories of their life together haunting him. He'd think back to the small moments, the coffee dates, the shared glances, the late-night talks, and feel a pang of sadness. He mourned the woman he thought he'd known, the future they had planned.